If you take a look at the moral landscape in the 19th and early 20th century, you're going to see two concepts used repeatedly that have to some degree fallen out of modern usage. The first is decadence, and the second is degeneration. So these are ways of articulating a certain form of moral anxiety. And if you look at texts from, say, the Victorian period, they're absolutely central to how people saw what was going on in their society and how they saw and evaluated individuals. Now, in a sense, the fact that we don't use them so often makes them historically interesting. What is it for a moral concept to fall out of use in this way? Another reason that they're interesting is that, to some degree, they're making a comeback. So far-right or rightist movements, from Bolsonaro's Brazil to parts of the Italian fascist scene, are engaged in rehabilitating the notion of degeneration. So it's worth thinking about what it might mean, how it works. Another reason they're interesting philosophically is that they were of vital importance to certain philosophers, certain intellectuals who we still need to understand today. Nietzsche, for example, makes frequent use of both degeneration and decadence when explaining his relationship to the idea of life. And it's not just philosophers. Darwin, for example, in his Descent of Man, talks about degeneration. And you see it all the way through a lot of Victorian biology. So we've got these reasons for understanding these concepts: the role they used to play, the role they might begin to play again, and their centrality to certain philosophical texts. But what exactly do they amount to? Well, let's take degeneration first. The basic idea is the explanation of social or moral trends in biological terms, often, typically, in pseudo-scientific biological terms. So it's an attempt to apply a model taken from the natural sciences to explain social change. In doing so, individuals or groups are often seen as degenerate, and irredeemably so. You have a lot of bacteria comparison. Okay, there's a social force that is threatening to the larger group, just as a virus is threatening to the larger body. And of course, the classic example of this kind of thinking you find in Germany under the Third Reich. So if you think of the exhibition Degenerate Art, that's an attempt to explain and to present certain artistic modernist trends as both degenerate aesthetically and degenerate racially and degenerate socially. Now, at this point you might be thinking, well, why should we be interested in this concept? It's clearly just an artifact of a deeply unpleasant form of racism. But things are more complex than that. So one reason is the very widespread nature of its use. So it's not just figures on the right. Someone like Tressel, for example, in his Ragged Trousers Philanthropists, also makes frequent use of the notion of degeneration. And I mentioned Darwin too. So we need to see it as a part of a broader set of social, cultural, intellectual trends in the period. The idea that you can explain moral change by appeal to a kind of biological paradigm, by the idea of falling away from a certain ideal type of the species. And that's frequently supplemented with worries about population growth, urbanization, the decline of the health of the population. Now, I mentioned Nietzsche before, and he's a particularly interesting case because, as ever, his view is never simple or predictable. So he uses this kind of degeneration language, but he also often flips it. There's a really interesting passage in Human All Too Human where he talks about ennoblement through degeneration. This is completely at odds with, for example, the fascist view in which degeneration is a negative thing. What Nietzsche suggests is that groups that are in some sense degenerate, because they're destabilizing forces, are also productive forces. Now, of course, we may still have deep concerns about the terminology, but you can see that even in the period it's functioning in a more complex way than in cases like the Nazis' degenerate art model. And this brings me to the second concept I want to talk about, that of decadence. So decadence, if you think of particularly 19th century Europe, is a classic point of orientation for thinking about matters of sexual morality and artistic style. You have groups of writers, for example, Huysmans, Wilde, who are often presented as ambassadors of decadence, where this is seen as a certain highly stylized, highly artificial, perhaps ironic departure from conventional moral norms in favor of an aestheticized alternative, one that the period saw as morally deeply problematic. Perhaps the most important philosophical trend to emerge from the Decadentist movement was the idea of art for art's sake, that faced with the often suffocating moral demands of the age, artists would present their work as deliberately in a purely aesthetic sphere, unhindered by moral concerns, and able to dabble with and explore and experiment with all that decadence had to offer. You see this in people like Gautier, you see this in Wilde as well. But again, you can see that things are more complicated here than they might first appear. And again, Nietzsche is a nice way to understand that. He talks about this vision of art for art's sake, and his response is that it falls radically short of what's needed. It's because, he says, of the threats of decadence and degeneration, of an attitude to life that he sees as weakening our ability to affirm this world, that art cannot, for him, be merely an aesthetic matter. Art for art's sake, he says, misses the whole point, which is that art must be for the sake of something, for the sake of changing our social attitudes, changing our attitude towards ourselves, changing our attitude towards life itself.